And we will get started. My name is Andrea Malcolm. I am the director at Historic Denver's Molly Brown House Museum. And my cohort this evening is Allison Salutes, our director of programs for Historic Denver, including walking tours and things like that. So we will kick off here in a minute. We are recording this evening, so you're welcome to keep your cameras off, and if everyone could mute their audio, and we'll have plenty of opportunities for you to use the chat room and to ask questions of both of our speakers this evening. All right, I think I'm going to, Allison, if it's all right, I think I'll go ahead and get started. All right, well, again, welcome everyone. My name is Andrea Malcolm. I'm the director of Historic Denver's Molly Brown House Museum. This is our new Empowered by Place series, where we are taking our event, the Salon series, which we did at the Molly Brown House Museum, using the story of Margaret Brown to draw a thread between social issues of her day and social issues today. As well as our RE Denver series, where we were looking at issues related to the built environment in Denver. So we started for our 50th anniversary, decided to mash those together and talk about sort of issues that are social justice related, also built environment related, and how we sort of, love and know our city of Denver. So I'm going to open up this evening with a land acknowledgement, and I'm going to start sharing screen as well, so you can see what we have going on. Tonight we're talking about legacy businesses and the notion of how we can preserve some of those places in our city. And our main topic is El Chapultepec, and we'll dive into that in a little bit. But first I want to acknowledge that with respect that the land we're discussing today is traditional and ancestral homelands of the Arapaho, Cheyenne, and Ute nations. This was also an important site of trade for numerous other Native tribes. So we recognize the Indigenous peoples as original stewards of this land and their descendants who still reside here. As these words of acknowledgement are spoken and heard, the historic and present ties these nations have to their traditional homelands are renewed and reaffirmed. I'd also like to thank SCFD, the Scientific and Cultural Facilities District, for annual funding of the Molly Brown House Museum and the programs that we do that help support the cultural heritage of our city through the citizens of our 7 counties. We are going to launch a poll now so we can get a sense of where everyone is coming from and what SCFD county you reside in. Oops. Allison, are you able to launch poll?
Yes, it is launched. It's the funny thing about being a co-host. You don't see it, but it's going and people are responding.
So just let us know what county you're joining us from that you reside in, whether that's Denver, or one of the other counties, or if you're outside of the 7-county district, or if you're even outside of Colorado or outside the US, we'd like to know where you are coming from. And Allison, if you just want to let me know when you've closed the poll. And I will go ahead too and sort of give an introduction. So of course, when we're walking around Denver, we can still see many of the places that our own Margaret Molly Brown walked by, the places she helped to build, the places she shopped at, the places she either performed or watched performances at, and these places that made up the fabric of our city. Margaret herself actually worked at the Daniels and Fisher department store in Leadville, Colorado, something not very many people know. And then she would have shopped at their flagship store on the 16th Street, what we know is the 16th Street Mall today. So today, though, you can go see live cabaret in the only remaining piece of that building, which is the clock tower. And you see a historic image of the clock tower there when it was still connected to the rest of the structure, Daniels and Fisher. Historic Denver also has an easement on the Elitch Theater, a place where Margaret Brown is said to have performed and maybe even yodeled at. Who knew the woman could yodel? And just blocks from her home, she was able to purchase a Fritchley electric car at the Mammoth Auto Works, which then became an ice skating rink and is now, of course, the Fillmore concert venue. You can actually see a photograph there of the car that she purchased, and her two nieces are in there getting excited for a ride around town in the car. So that's some of the places that Mrs. Brown was able to experience in Denver that we can still have a glimpse of or experience today. It was 1 year after Margaret Brown's death that a jazz club opened up on 20th and Market, El Chapultepec, or the Peck. In December of 2020, it was announced that the Peck was a victim of the pandemic. It would not be reopening. So our question tonight is, what happens when we lose these beloved Denver institutions? And if there are other beloved places that you miss or can't live without, we ask that you drop them in the chat. And then you can also have ask questions of our speakers, drop them in the chat, and later Allison will pass them along during our Q&A session. So why does it matter when we lose a place like El Chapultepec? So here to tell us about the history of the Peck is Arturo Gomez, who has been part of the KUVO Jazz as music director and community liaison since the spring of 2003. Arturo was fortunate to have been raised listening to the impressive radio stations of first the Bronx, New York, and then Los Angeles. He instilled in him a love and knowledge of many music styles. An award-winning music director, Arturo has been awarded Music Director of the Year on 6 occasions and has also been the recipient of the prestigious Duke Dubois Lifetime Achievement and Bobby Jackson Jazz Ambassador honors. And Arturo brings an enthusiastic and passionate approach to the airwaves and to streaming audiences. He's been a member of the 5 Points Jazz Festival Organizing Committee since attending in 2003 and involved in many different musical and cultural festivals along the Front Range and conducted tours of the historic 5 Points District. So he's taken to El Chapultepec to enjoy music, never realizing the Peck would be a frequent hangout. So he's got great knowledge of the history, and I'm going to turn it over to Arturo to tell us that fascinating story.
Well, good evening, everyone. I really appreciate being invited to be a part of this fun event this evening. There are many people here in Denver that are more qualified to speak of the El Chapultepec because they have lived here their entire lives and have been a physical part of it for much longer than I have. And many of those are musicians themselves. So, I feel a little bit, maybe overwhelmed that I was asked, and I appreciate it, and I'll do my best to share what I have knowledge of El Chapultepec, because since arriving in Denver, I've kind of become a historian, so to say, of the jazz scene here through my love of jazz on a radio format, and then discovering of how rich a history Denver has in jazz, not only with El Chapultepec, but for 17 years, I've worked in the historic 5 Points District, which has always been the home of jazz and blues in Denver, going back even before El Chapultepec. And before I moved here, I'm fortunate that before I moved to Denver in 2003, I was 1 week vacation for my previous radio station I worked for here in Denver, where I served as an intern at KUVO in 1994, and then again another week as an intern in 1996. And that gave me a unique perspective on the Peck because that was before Coors Field, when that portion of town was considered, using an old school term, Skid Row. When you would go there at night, you had to be careful, even as a man. And ladies were not recommended to go on their own to go see the Peck because it wasn't in the best of areas before Coors Field changed everything and converted it to Lodo. So even before I moved to Denver or even visited, I had heard of the Peck, as I have heard of many a jazz club across the country that I had never been to or didn't go to at the time, because when you're a jazz fan, you learn about jazz clubs throughout the land and really throughout the world. And the Peck was one of those. And after I returned from my first visit to Denver and I got back to Miami, where I was living at the time, everybody would say, especially the musicians, hey, did you go to the Peg? Did you go to El Chapultepec? I go, how do you know about that? That's just a little hole in the wall. They go, oh yeah. And so then when I moved here, by that time in 2003, of course, Coors Field was already there, and they started changing the neighborhood. It became hip, a hangout. And that eventually led really to the downfall of the Peck. But the Peck was the place before that, let's go back a little bit now, that when Jerry Krantz, the second owner of it, took it over the Peck, which was really founded as I understand, like a German polka bar and club, is what I understand. And then when Jerry Krantz got it in the 40s, being a jazz fan, he started presenting jazz in the Peck, and it started to mushroom, and so many amazing musicians honed their skills at the Peck. And then starting in the late 40s, one of the more amazing things occurred. Outsiders, traveling musicians would start going to the Peck. And some of the biggest names have gone to El Chapultepec to sit in with the house band. And that was the place to go, for so many years as the only place, other than maybe one or two leftovers in the 5 Points from its glory days of the 40s and 50s. But in the 60s and 70s, the Points already was more or less shut down for what we know it as being the jazz mecca, and El Chapultepec became the cathedral of jazz in Denver, despite his, his ordinary appearances and ordinary, food and stuff, but it was the ambiance that was golden, and that kept the people coming despite being in a, less than, safe neighborhood. And it's the music, and there's Mr. Krantz right there. I had the pleasure of being introduced to him because the first time I was taken to the Peck as a visitor in 1994, my current boss, and at that time just friend and mentor, Carlos Lando, who's been part of the jazz scene since the 70s here in Denver, took me and introduced me to Jerry Krantz, saying, hey, this is Arturo from Miami. And he said, blah, blah, blah. And he was grateful. He asked me if I was Cuban. I go, yeah, and blah, blah, blah. And we hit it off. Same with his daughter. They treated me very well, and because of Carlos Lando. And then when I moved here, it became my hangout. And I saw the change, how it went from in the neighborhood, be careful bar, but great jazz club, to how they try to adjust to the new visitors of the now Lodo area, who were more interested in going there and having cocktails than listening to jazz. So what the Chapultepec did, and rightfully so, started to bring non-jazz acts. And not as many of the great jazz names would stop by because there was less jazz, and there was other clubs opening up around Denver that, took away some of their dedicated jazz listeners. So it was remarkable, but what a great view. And Freddie Rodriguez, the late legendary Freddie Rodriguez Sr. on the right, who we lost due to COVID about a year ago, who was playing at the Peck right up to a few months before he passed. Amazing. And KUVO right there in that first booth that you're showing, KUVO used to broadcast live shows there in the 90s. And the two hosts were Carlos Lando and my predecessor as music director at KUVO Jazz, Andy O'Leary, Andy O, who is now our morning host Monday through Friday. They would sit in that very first booth there, and with all the noise and all the commotions, they would broadcast, live jazz from El Chapultepec. And it was amazing. And you can see some of the photos of the legends that have played at the Peck. They had consistently a lot of the West Coast act, Los Angeles and San Francisco artists, because of the proximity to Denver, they would often come in, as well as Chicago-based museums would come in once a week. That's Keith Oxman, award-winning educator and saxophonist. He cut his teeth there, and so many nationally known artists from Denver cut their teeth and honed their skills there. Javon Jackson, Brad Lely, Tia Fuller, all of these, you know? And so it is just a historic place. And when one loses a jazz club or any other institution, especially a cultural or music institution, more so than, let's say, a business, but that's just dollars. But when you lose a place like a museum or a gallery or a jazz club or a restaurant, it's more than that. It's an ambiance. It's sentimental. It becomes part of you. The experiences you have being in those places, like mine coming in before I even lived in Denver, those 2 occasions that I went to. And I saw and met musicians that are now some of my best friends, you know, and I go, hey, I first saw you at the Peck. And again, you can see more pictures here of the greats that have played or have stopped by to play at the Peck. And a lot of those West Coast musicians are maybe known to our viewers, people like Red Holloway, Teddy Edwards, Gerald Wiggins. A lot of these folks that are huge names, they would come here at the Peck once a year. Eddie Harris from Chicago would come once a year. They would hold court. And so like I said, I'm just privileged that, you know, that I got to experience a little bit of the before and after, so to say. And hats off and the greatest admiration for Jerry Krantz, because he was a take no prisoners. He didn't allow for anybody to get out of hand or to be messed with. He was literally known for jumping over the bar and grabbing somebody much bigger than him and throwing them out in the street. That was not unusual. He did not allow any, you know, misbehavior in his club. If you were drunk, out you go. You were there to enjoy the music. And also the highest admiration for that man for doing that. And then his 2 daughters, they, you know, they did the best they can to keep it open. Oh, the young daughter even opened up El Chapultepec too on the north side on 38th Street, trying to create a secondary Peck, but it never took hold, sadly, like the first one did. And then she came back to work with her older sister at the Peck. And, you know, heck, they did a great job after Lodo changed. And that they, yes, Bill Clinton, he stopped by the Peck. Somebody asked about Bill Clinton. And so one of the many names that stopped by. So they did a great job. And sadly, like with so many other businesses and institutions across the country and even the world, COVID knocked them out of the box and, you know, put the final stamp of you're out on them. And it still hurts, you know, since they closed. I wasn't there because of COVID, but I saw it live on Zoom with Carlos Lando being the MC, and there wasn't a dry eye in the house or on Zoom. It's part of you. That scene right there is classic. You know, you can see the Lodo signs on the lamppost, you know, right on Kitty Corner across this Coors Field, the ballpark neighborhood. So that will be forever embedded into my mind and my memories. I would love to hear, yeah, the smoke coming out of the walls is so true. As they say, if the walls could speak, oh my goodness, the stories. And what went behind in the green room, you know, which was really the storage room for the musicians, the stories that came out of there, most of them can't be repeated here. Oh, but I would love to hear some of the experiences of our viewers or other panelists have to say. I appreciate it. I hope I didn't, you know, take up too much time.
Arturo, what are what's the relationship between the PEC and some of the other great live music institutions in Denver, like the Rossonian or other places like that? Like, how did that sort of, landscape work in Denver between all the clubs?
They each are on their own, and they're each on the highest echelons, on the tallest plateau of our great jazz clubs. The Rossonian, well, its history is longer because it goes back to the 1910s and 1920s, and it had different circumstances revolving around the Rossonian because of the fact that there was, segregation at the time. Even though the 5 points and the Rossonian was always integrated, there was a certain way to get there, different than El Chapultepec, but they worked together. They weren't enemies. They were collaborators. They would, work with each other the same as the jazz clubs of today do. But at that time, there was also like the Rainbow Room, and then came a place on 15th Avenue in downtown Denver that got a magnificent reputation, Ebbets Field, which a jazz club there that's much beloved to this day, 30 years after his demise. And there were other ones, other clubs all around town. Pierre's, which was a restaurant, would host after hours in the 70s and 80s. In the 50s, there was 2 after hours clubs on Welton Street, 5 Points, including one called Lil's, which opened up at 1 and closed at 9, which was across the street from the former KUVO building, which has a few months ago, we've moved to the ballpark neighborhood, not far from the PEC now. But anyhow, before we moved, we were across the street from what was the 50s club called Lil's, where Dizzy Gillespie showed up after hours, where Charlie Parker showed up after hours, because they would play the Rossonian and some other places around town early, but by 12, 1 o'clock, they have to come back to the Point because it was the only place they could stay. They could play in the hotel, but not be able to stay there. So they would stay in private homes and in different lodging that they had in the 5 Points area, including the Rossonian. And that's why they would go at 1, 2, 3 in the morning, because jazz musicians are nocturnal. So 1, 2, 3 in the morning is their morning, not their overnight. So they would go to these after-hour clubs and speakeasies along Welton. But that their demise came way before the PEC, because by the mid-60s, early 70s, that scene on Welton was gone, and El Chapultepec continued. In fact, it probably, most people who have lived it say the 70s and early 80s was like, that was the golden era, when the most out-of-town artists were there and the most guest artists were coming, including celebrities, not just musicians.
Who were some of those musicians featured on the walls?
Well, Eddie Harris is great saxophonist out of Chicago is one, as I mentioned. Teddy Edwards out of Los Angeles. There's great piano player Jerry Wiggins from Los Angeles, and there's pictures of Wynton Marsalis who's been there. There's a picture of I believe, I didn't see it. They might have put that one away really well. There's supposedly a picture of Clint Eastwood at the PEC. And because he's a jazz fan and a jazz musician, most people don't realize he plays jazz piano and has recorded jazz musicians and stuff. But anyhow, so, oh yeah, Andy Garcia, when he was filming that movie here in Denver, something to do, Live and Die in Denver or something like that.
Yeah, Things to Do in Denver When You're Dead, I think.
Right, that's the one. When that was filmed here, he being a musician and a music fan, as well as an actor, he came to the PEC, so yeah, the who's who of their, I guess I should have prepared more on the celebrity side of names for this evening, but so, because it's a nice list of great, musicians and celebrities and dignitaries too have come by. Anybody who's a jazz fan When you walked in the door of the jazz of the El Chapultepec, didn't matter who you were. You're in there because you're a jazz fan. Everybody.
What were some of your favorite shows?
Ooh, one of my favorite shows was getting to see Eddie Harris because I had never seen him before. And the reason is it was so pleasant for me was not only his magnificent playing, but his banter between the audience. He would crack jokes in between and he'd go back and forth because, hey, he came up in Chicago in the 40s, you know, in neighborhood bars. So he was used to the back and forth that was customary in neighborhood bars. So he felt right at home at the Peck and it showed his exuberance. I left that, I don't think I touched the ground for a week.
That's great.
Yeah.
I was curious, Arturo, as a music director, something as you were talking, it struck me that you kept saying that people were cutting their teeth at the Peck. Is that an important part of having a thriving music scene in a city? Like, do you need to have places where newer musicians can kind of cut their teeth as well as these more accomplished folks?
Oh, absolutely. You hit the very essence of becoming a good musician because there are so many of the younger generations that are so far superiorly educated in music than the masters of jazz past, because now there's universities and colleges and music classes from high school on, and they learn to read music, they learn how to arrange it, to play it, they know the history, but it's different if you don't have a place to play it with elders where you can pick up influences from them and make them your own, and to express yourself on a stage with people, and you feel that symbiotic relationship between the listener and the player. So it's extremely important. And especially now that there's a growing younger audience that doesn't have that experience. Because in their towns, there may only be auditoriums or big events, an outdoor event. It's not the same as having a club like this, where the young musicians who's going to college can go after, you know, their studies and go play with polished musicians from Denver, as well as those master musicians traveling through. And those, almost every one of those musicians is happy to share tips and knowledge with their younger counterparts. That's a tradition in jazz. You pass the baton. Yeah, there are those that don't want to be bothered or don't want to share anything, and you get your own stuff. Yeah, there's always that and everywhere. But the vast majority, jazz musicians are some of the best people to know because they travel the world and they get to see things the average person doesn't. And then they're doing something so special. So anyhow, you know, yes, it's extremely important that Chapultepec is one of our jazz patrimonies here in Denver. And it's a void that will never be filled.
Thank you, Arturo. We're going to jump to our next speaker, Brie Davies. And then after we hear from Brie a bit, we'll sort of all circle back around and do some Q&A and have some chances to let other people share some of the great stories that they've already been dropping in the chat. So Brie Davies is our next speaker, and she is a multimedia journalist and community advocate born and raised in Denver, sort of in the do-it-yourself art and music scene. She co-founded and produced several music and arts festivals and has toured the country with various bands. So as well as being a decades-long practice in arts and organizing, Davies has also cultivated a career as a reporter, writer, producer, and host. And she's currently the first ever host of the daily news podcast, CityCast, launching soon, right, Brie?
Yeah,
and then, in the end of March. Yeah, she's also penned a column for Westward on issues facing Denver citizens and the built environment. In 2018, she created Hello Denver, Are You Still There? To explore the intersections between art and city planning, affordable housing advocacy, and municipal politics. She was the press and communications sorceress, I love that term, for the Kalen for Mayor 2019 campaign, and uses social media as a means to engage people in actions and solutions. So at the heart of this is Brie's passion for advocacy for all ages, accessibility, inclusivity, anti-racism, and autonomous DIY art spaces. So we're going to hand it over to Brie to sort of fill us in more about how the PEC fits into this larger scene and what it means for us to lose the PEC.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Historic Denver, for inviting me. And I'm honored to share space with Arturo, whose voice I love listening to every day. And Arturo, I just want to say, I know that you're not from here, but what matters to me is when someone comes to Denver and embraces our city and our culture and our history, and you've done that so well. So I'm so glad that you're a part of our community, particularly our music community, which is really what is at the heart of this story, is the music community here in Denver. And that's, I'm just honored to be able to talk about El Chapultepec. I'm a musician myself, but I'm not a jazz or a blues player, so I didn't play at the PEC, but so many of my friends were sort of the next generation, did grow up going and playing and performing there. My friend Wesley Watkins comes to mind, who's a trumpeter, and you may know him he played in a little band called Nathaniel Rateliff and the Night Sweats for a little while. So, but you could catch him all around Denver, but he's one of those guys that if you wanted to run into him, you could run into him at the PEC.
Brie, permit me to interrupt you.
Yeah.
Falling in love with Denver was very easy. I didn't have to work on it. It just happened, and I embraced it and ran with it. But thank you very much.
Of course. Well, thank you. That's all that really matters to me, is if you're here and you care. So I think I was asked to come on and be a part of this conversation because like it was said, I put out a newsletter every month called Hello Denver, Are You Still There? And it's about our city, our culture, and our people. In January, I wrote a post entitled Dive Bars, Fern Bars, Brutalism, and Demolition, Why We're Allowed to Feel Sad When It Comes to Losing Buildings and Businesses We Love. And this piece that I wrote was really spurred by the closure of El Chapultepec. Just the reaction I saw from my musician friends, especially on social. I mean, I got like 10 texts, I think, the day that it was announced that it closed. It was such a huge hole in our music community. And I wrote the piece in part because I felt it was really necessary to give us permission to grieve the loss of that business in the space, because El Chapultepec is such a vital part of our music scene. And Arturo gave some great historical context to what that music scene looked like when the PEC opened, and when the Crances took over, and really it was embedded in the local and national jazz scene and blues scene. And I think that it doesn't necessarily get the same credit that a lot of Denver venues get when we talk about, like people talk about us as a live music city. We're a live music city, but what venues are mentioned? It's usually like our beautiful movie houses turned venues, which are wonderful. The Bluebird, the Ogden, the Gothic, the Fillmore. And then we're known nationally for our like big and flashy spaces like Red Rocks, which is one of a kind, or the newer Mission Ballroom. But El Chapultepec was woven more into this fabric of our sort of dive bar venue scene, which is just as vital to the music community as these other larger venues are. When I think about El Chapultepec, I think about its location. First of all, it was in downtown, and the other bars and venues that played a similar role that were nowhere near the caliber of El Chapultepec, but like a Herb's or Bar. There used to be a great spot called Old Curtis Street. These were true dive bars, but they were venues. They were places you would go to see music. And I think El Chapultepec was definitely like the top of the top for this type of venue. And it played such an important role in the bigger ecosystem of our music community because it had the respect of local and national jazz and blues acts like Arturo talked about. To me, it's up there with Red Rocks in terms of importance of Colorado venues. Like if you think about places that you go to see and experience and cross paths with musicians, El Chapultepec was the place to go. And again, with the location, I think we took for granted that it was there at some points. I know for me, it was always there. It was never not there. And for someone who's not really into the Lodo, bar crowd scene. It was one of those little havens or oases where you could go and hear live music. It didn't matter who was playing or what was going on. It was just like a little bit of a respite from the insanity of downtown, especially if you've ever been downtown during a Rockies game, not intentionally, like if you accidentally get caught in the flow of that traffic, the human traffic, it's bananas. And then there's just this universe in itself of El Chapultepec. But like Arturo talked about, that sort of didn't do it any favors in that there wasn't a lot of intersection or crossover of the Lodo bar crowd or the Rockies crowd to El Chapultepec, but they managed to stay there and they managed to do it no matter what. And excuse me. So this kind of goes back to me to like why it was so heavy when it closed. And I think there's just a unique sense of loss that we feel when we lose something like El Chapultepec that's got such it's within the context of Denver. It's the fabric of the city. It's something that we know and understand as a beacon of culture and experience. When I think about Denver, that's what I thought. That's one of the places that I would think about. And it's such an important space, again, it's not just for music lovers, it's a place for musicians. This is where musicians go to be with other musicians, to play with other musicians, to jam with other musicians. And my husband actually is a touring musician, and one of our first dates, he took me there, and I realized later it was sort of a test for me to see if I loved this dive bar as much as it meant to him as a musician. And I passed the test because we're married. But I'm also a bar kid. I also grew up going to bars with my parents. So it was not uncommon for me to be in a space like that. But I knew I'm a musician. I know how important that space is. And so kind of going back to my piece that I wrote, we have a lot of human feelings about inanimate objects and businesses. And so this is a little excerpt from my newsletter that I wanted to read about that loss, that feeling of that loss. Buildings and spaces help us develop our identities. Sure, we always chalk these relationship and identity building moments to the experiences we have and the people we encounter within a building or a space. But the physical space makes a mark on us too. It's why we feel sad when a building we love is slated for demolition or when a business we adore closes forever. If you've lived in Denver for, at least 5 years, chances are a business you probably really cared about has closed or a building you've admired has been torn down. And it's just kind of the way our city does it. Close up shop, scrape everything away, and move on to the next experience. We're not really supposed to have these feelings about spaces because they're not ours and they don't belong to us. But that's kind of what this conversation comes down to me. And I just want to remind people it's okay to feel that sadness and disappointment when a thing that you love closes, because businesses are not purely spaces for transaction. It was just, a bar is not just a place where people go to drink. El Chapultepec was, you may have had personal investment in that space. That might have been the place that you go to meet people, to jam with other people, to see your favorite, like Arturo said, see one of your favorite jazz musicians of all time. So that place not existing anymore, it's kind of surreal. And I think it's okay to feel, I felt like not angry at the family because I understand running that business is difficult, but I was like, what are we going to do? Like, how do we do this now? So that's kind of was my take on the loss of the space and what it meant for Denver as a whole. Thank you.
No, thank you, Brie. That was wonderful. And I know you didn't necessarily write that piece, like thinking about historic preservation, but I think a lot of us read it and we're like, yes, exactly. I think a lot of times we feel like we are right at those crossroads between, there's the logistical side of our brain that understands, a building, it's 4 walls and a roof, and at certain times some things go down because the community has certain needs and other pieces go up. But I really think that you make so many good points in that article that we do all really feel sad that these businesses don't hold transactional spaces, right? Like we all have places, like even El Chapultepec being a part of the story that you and your husband crafted into your life. I think we all have that place, the first date restaurant that no longer exists. And it's harder to tell that story when you can't stand in front of the building and say, it was here and we felt this and we wanted to do this. So thank you again for being here and just sharing those thoughts, because I like the chat is going crazy, which is awesome, because that's exactly what I wanted. Actually, before you guys all signed in, I was like, I just want everyone to feel comfortable enough to talk. And so I'm hoping that that's what's happening, because people are sharing memories of El Chapultepec, reactions to things closing, just these really like human feelings that I think that we all have. And so I think it's a really great place to start a conversation with both our panelists, because I think they both, and let me add Arturo to our spotlight here, because they both have really real feelings about this. And then I want to open it up to all our folks watching too, because this is like big important stuff in a way. It's us, our community, thinking about what we want Denver to be. I think in so many ways, and I think Arturo and Brie both said this in different ways, but that like Denver is a big city, but it's not that big. Like everybody kind of knows everybody. You can run into somebody. And I think that is kind of this beautiful part that's demonstrated in both of their stories here. So I just kind of wanted to ask, I'm gonna start by picking on Brie and Arturo, but I want you guys to start thinking about your questions and answers to questions that are flying around. Feel free to put more in the chat there. But without the PEC in that building, it does seem like now maybe the building is going to stick around. Do you have any like hopes or aspirations for that corner? And either of you can go first.
I mean, I think it's hard because, and Arturo alluded to this too, it was kind of its own thing within. What was happening outside of the building was so different than what was happening inside of the building. So, I mean, it's a hard thing to replace. It's a lovely building, but it's kind of like, this is the time at which it's probably going to have to acclimate to the rest of the surroundings and become something that's more Lodo. I don't know. I mean, it's a great spot, but I don't want it to become one of those things that's like a plaque of what once was here. It's like, is that any better than it just not being there at all? You know, because you can't bring it back. There will be another place where jazz and blues musicians come, but there will never be something like that again. So I don't know what could go there.
Well, Brie, I kind of gonna piggyback on what you're saying is, you know, sadly, the family never owned the building. They were always, you know, lessers, you know, they always were leasing in the establishment. And they look back, as they say, 2020, you know, vision, but Hein vision is 2020. But I don't see it turning into a music club and much less a jazz club. It doesn't lend itself in that area. I hope that if the owner eventually, once COVID kind of passes through, when we start reestablishing the new normalcy of what it will be, chances are it's going to be some kind of upscale eatery or cocktail bar or something without music. Or maybe once in a while they may bring in one guy on a keyboard or a DJ or something like that. Maybe that. But it's never going to be a music club or a jazz club. And it might even not even look like it does now, because they may want to remodel it, because there's no sentiment for the ownership and the new business owner going to that corner facility that it's the PEC. Oh yeah, it was a jazz club. Okay, so what? They didn't live it. They weren't here. They didn't feel it. It's just brick and mortar to them. Unless, in the perfect world, some music lover or musicians or people involved decide, hey, let's go retro. Let's do something new. Not that it'll be the new PEC. You don't want that, because you can never replace it, unless it's the family who does this. If they get backing, I don't think so. They express no interest. But anyhow, hopefully another group of entrepreneurs can come in and maybe say, hey, let's do this a new Peck, you know, call it whatever, and try to do a jazz club or a music club there. It's possible, but not too likely. I would bet those are the longest odds of all for it to happen. Although it would be my choice, it doesn't seem that that could possibly work in today's society. But who knows after COVID? We don't know. Things may change. Money may come, may be dropped down. Hey, it's an historical business, a historical building. Here's some money. Do something with it in a retro style. Who knows? We don't have a crystal ball, but that would be the best case scenario.
Yeah, that probably would be the best case scenario. Are there any other businesses that you both are watching, kind of hoping, crossing your fingers that they make it through to when we see live music regularly in venues again?
I mean, I'm worried about all music venues that are independently owned in general. Like, I'm friends with the Oriental Theater guys, and like operating a space that large without any income over a year is just like, it's terrifying. And I worry about them. I don't know what their status is, so I don't want to put any information out there that's not true, but I think about them, or like places like the High Dive, just the smaller clubs that aren't run by AEG, don't have the kind of backing and that they need to survive. And so far, I think everybody's doing okay. I'm hoping, you know, it's kind of a situation with the Peck where they didn't own their buildings, so it's kind of not up to them. But I did hear a statistic today that 25%, Denver lost 25% of its restaurants over COVID, which is a huge, I mean, the loss is so huge that I don't even know if we know how to comprehend that until we're out in the world again. But in general, I just worry about any independently owned venues that are left, hoping that they can hold on until they can open up again.
Well, Brie, I can add to that, saying that there are several independent owned jazz and blues clubs that are hanging in there and doing fairly well under the circumstances. One is Dazzle in downtown Denver.
Yes.
15th and Curtis. They're in the historic Bowers building. And they have held their own during the COVID by offering streaming concerts where people pay the musicians through Venmo or PayPal, or something to that effect. And since Denver opened up a little bit, they have 25% capacity now, must be masked. Even if you're vaccinated, you still need to wear a mask, and you have social distance and limited seating. Same with the Nocturne in Rhino on Larimer and 21st, 22nd, or 23rd, whatever it is. It's in Rhino. They're doing the same thing, and they are known for their cuisine, that they, you know, have some very tasty dishes along with jazz. And another place that's hanging in there is up in Lafayette called the Muse Performance Space. It's a nonprofit jazz club run by 2 musicians, and they're doing the same, streaming and limited capacity audiences. And now, thanks to Norman Harris, who puts on Juneteenth every year, he has returned after 1 year absence, the first Friday jazz hop on Welton Street in the Points. It began last Friday, and it's in the Charles Cousin Plaza, which is in between the library, Blair Caldwell Library, and Sonny Lawson's Park. The plaza sandwiched in between there. And so there's live music there the first Friday of every month. And up the street, the Club 705 might start doing the same thing on occasion, limited capacity. So fortunately, because Denver supports live music and cultural events, and it's above average in book sales and in book reading across the country, as well as in attendance for music and buying of music, these independent clubs can continue. And Roy made a perfect example of another good place. It's up in Boulder, and it's called Cafe Soleil. Very fine food, and they do music there as well. And anyhow, so it's not easy, you know, and we'll never have another pet because those things take decades to develop. So I know I won't see it. Maybe some of you younger participants might see it in 20 or 30 years. But yeah, so hopefully that we can plant a new seed and it'd be another oak tree to grow. You know, I sure hope so. By the
Yeah.
way, one final thing, if I'm permitted to say this, as a member of the organizing committee of the 5 Points Jazz Festival for 17 years, last year there was a virtual Jazz Point Festival. We're not sure that there will even be a virtual one because of Arts and Venue, which is an agency of the city county of Denver, relies on the income they generate. And they don't get assistance from the city county. And most of the revenue comes from Red Rocks. And since Red Rocks has a fraction of the income coming in, and the other venues under the control of Arts and Venues, the income has really shrunk hardly to anything. We're working on coming up with a sponsor or something to put on some kind of maybe reduced 5 Points Jazz Festival, hopefully full-fledged, we don't know, but it will be virtual, you know, because we can't have, you know, thousands of people gathered on Wilton Avenue and in the plaza. It's just, you know, the city county cannot take that, you know, risk. Maybe a private guy might want to do it, but a city county agency will not risk something like that.
Yeah, and actually this is kind of on track with what you're saying right now, but Sasha did have a question of clarification for you, Arturo, which was
Sure.
that you mentioned that the PEC wasn't doing as much jazz there, and she was just curious if that's because it's not popular or if it was an attempt to cultivate a new audience.
Well, it was a little bit of both. They didn't do it because they wanted to do it. They did it as a way to try to survive and get different audiences more engaged, because their patronage had changed when it became more a Lodo as we know it today than what it was before. You know, they all those people from the ballpark after the game, before the game, and the other nightclubs for dancing that were in the area, the patronage changed. So they had to adapt to that, because sadly, the traditional jazz crowd, a lot of them, they were older and they didn't want to be bothered with, oh, I have to go down to Lodo, find a place to park and get into the Chapultepec. And at that time they had to compete with the younger crowds who really were more cocktail drinking oriented, with the music in the background that's white noise more than the jazz person who goes to listen. So they had to kind of adapt, and it helped them for several years, but then COVID came and that kind of put the nail in the coffin. Who knows if you know, COVID had not arrived, they probably might still be open.
Yeah, it does make you wonder, especially seeing all the places closed as you drive around town. This portion of our Q&A is almost over. We're about to transition to a new topic. So I just wanted to say, if anybody else had a question that you wanted me to ask either Brie or Arturo, feel free to type that in right now. And then I was gonna just have you guys maybe, well, let's see. I'll give 1 second to see if anything pops up in the chat before I just keep talking at you. Okay, I'm not seeing any more questions for our panelists. Andrea, do you want to move into our next section? Does that sound good?
Sure. I'm going to share screen real quick here, which is always fun. So to sort of look at the built environment and these great businesses that we have in our city, and what are some tools that can be added to the preservation toolbox that might step in situations like El Chapultepec and provide funding mechanisms or things like that. So I thought we would explore what some of the options might be here in Denver or could be here in Denver, and use some examples from other cities as well to sort of get around the notion of adding a legacy business program to the toolbox here in Denver. Denver does have a program currently called the Neighborhood Equity and Stabilization, which is targeting specific neighborhoods, and you can see those listed below: East Colfax, Elyria, Swansea. So really it was designed to help older neighborhoods with these types, El Chapultepec type businesses that had been around a long time and added to the character of the neighborhood and helped tell Denver's story, but maybe they were struggling with density issues, with development issues, with rising rents and things like that. So this program was created to sort of help these businesses with different marketing programs, small business funds and grants to help different businesses in the city. Of course, in Denver, we have city plans that are being developed, including the East Area Plan. East Area Plan and things like that, they look at neighborhood context, they look at the character of a neighborhood. But again, I think it's focused on the bricks and mortar aspect of it. So we might still have the El Chapultepec building for decades to come, but we're losing the business of El Chapultepec, those sort of things that were happening inside the structure. So I think we would challenge the city to maybe find a way to integrate sort of a notion of the business as well into these types of plans. And then the National Trust for Historic Preservation recently put out something from their Preservation Nation and Preservation Green Lab, just a study about what it means for neighborhoods to have these older and smaller buildings and what sort of businesses thrive in those neighborhoods, and how it contributes to a city. So that we need these old buildings for vigorous streets and districts, and they can't grow without them. These older businesses provide affordable and flexible spaces for entrepreneurs and businesses to come in. It adds to a creative economy in these mixed neighborhoods. And the arts and culture scenes can thrive. Small businesses like bookstores can thrive in these neighborhoods. So they really looked at what does it mean for our city to keep these lower density, older historic neighborhoods with that mix. And cities that have these neighborhoods tend to do better and thrive. And you can read the full report, and we'll put it in our sort of post-event notes that we'll send out. And then there's some actual legacy business programs around the country that maybe could serve as a model for something we could start here in Denver. In San Francisco, their Office of Small Business has created a couple different programs, actually. It started with the San Francisco Heritage's Legacy Bars and Restaurants Initiative. As everyone knows, San Francisco has undergone tremendous change in the last several decades, just like we have here in Denver. And so many bars and restaurants were being lost that they created this program for businesses that had been open 40 years or more, that were in some sort of distinctive space and contributed to the neighborhood through the history of their business. So they created different mechanisms to help these bars and restaurants with rent stabilization, things like that, business assistance grants. And then it was so successful, they went on and launched a legacy business registry and historical preservation fund. So a way to sort of help these businesses sort of protect the legacy of the business and how it contributes to the city, when it doesn't necessarily have to be tied to bricks and mortar and to structure. So these businesses commit to sort of preserving their business model, the activities that they do. And even if they're not in that space, after a time, they're committing to preserving, almost putting an easement on their business, to say we're committing to keeping this together. So San Francisco has this program and has actually served as a model and study for some other programs in the country. Seattle recently also did their own legacy business report to see if they could take the San Francisco model and get it going in Seattle, and they're working through the phases of it. But again, they're looking at what is the longevity of this business in their community. They're looking at things that have been older than 20 or 30-year-old businesses. They usually have small employees. They're not franchises, things like that. So they're looking at what is the mix in their city and how it can contribute to a legacy business program. And then LA Conservancy also has a program that they have started where you can see it says keeping mom and pop. So what makes our neighborhoods and communities unique, and how do we show love to these mom and pop and family businesses through different rental assistance, things like that, like the San Francisco program. So I think we wanted to show that there are programs out there in the country being formed, and it's something we could consider here in Denver as, a part of the preservation toolkit, especially with our, landmarking procedures and our different definitions of these have begun to include cultural heritage and not just being tied to buildings or spaces or landscapes and things like that. So we think there's an opportunity here in Denver to have something like a legacy business, that program that might be able to step in at some point and help a business like El Chapultepec beyond sort of, anything emergency like with PPP funds, but, rental assistance or different things to help protect that business. Because again, it's so vital to our city's heritage and culture. So with that, I think I'll stop sharing, Allison, and we can kind of turn it back over and open it up and just sort of ask the question to first Brie and Arturo, and then maybe the larger group. Is a legacy business program something we should have in Denver, given sort of, everything we were going through pre-COVID with all the development pressure, and then now with COVID, putting these businesses over the edge?
Well, I think it's a no-brainer that we should have it in Denver. It's interesting that some other cities around the country came to Denver in the early 2000s and early 2010s to see the renovation of the downtown area in Lodo and Rhino, that to model their similar areas of their hometowns after what Denver did. For instance, I happen to know that Miami did that, and I think Cleveland, as well as some other cities. Now there's also, you mentioned San Francisco has changed a lot. Yeah, but in my opinion, and most people's opinions, it's changed for the worse. It's become impossible to live there. They did not keep the legacy. They destroyed one of the most historic areas called the Mission District, which is kind of like a larger scale 5 Points area, let's say, so I hope that it doesn't happen like that here in Denver if that program comes. One thing I was encouraged about, and I'm not much into politics, I work for a nonprofit. I do not like doing business with corporate mega nationals. I support mom and pop businesses, even if it costs me more money, because I'm an entrepreneur and a former mom and pop businessman. I'm all about entrepreneurship, not corporations, which is why I work for a nonprofit and deal with nonprofits, volunteer my time for nonprofits. So I hope that that aspect of the renovation of San Francisco doesn't happen here in Denver, where we get destroyed and all these corporations come in instead of supporting the entrepreneur, the small business. That's the legacy of commerce, anyhow, in Denver. The small mom and pop just trying to make a living, and if that funding, however it's done, wherever it comes from, that's not something I get involved with. I don't know that part of it. But if the money, once it comes and it goes into a fund for legacy businesses and mom and pop small business entrepreneurship, yes, I hope it's used in the right places for the right businesses and not siphoned off into, the bureaucrats' pockets and and big business.
Yeah, I'm coming out of a career in urban planning. I actually worked on the East Area Plan, and I'm familiar with the legacy businesses programs like In the Hate. And the biggest thing, honestly, is ownership. Who owns the land? I mean, that's where we see so many, the PEC is a perfect example. Thriving business, decades old, didn't own its own building. And so if there is ability for businesses to at least own their buildings, it's a start. It's a little bit of a stake in the game, because when it comes down to it, it's all about real estate. I mean, part of the problem with a legacy business is often it's at the forefront because it's been there for so long of establishing the culture of a neighborhood. And we can't replace that culture. And that's something that really frustrated me working in urban planning, was there's this conversation about placemaking, like making a place. Well, you don't need to make a place if it already exists, and it just needs to be supported. And so like, you can't create, like, I think the oak tree metaphor that Arturo gave is so perfect for something like El Chapultepec. You can't create something like that overnight. No matter how much hype it gets, it doesn't matter how many Instagram photos are taken of a place. You can't create culture. Culture is created by people, and the ability for people to stay in their place and run their business and do what they've been doing for decades is so crucial. But it's unfortunate too, because sometimes we went through this in planning, you can save a business, but you can't save the displacement of the community around it that goes to that business. So if you save a panaderia, but then there's nobody to shop at that panaderia anymore, you know what I mean? So I think it just takes a larger movement. This is one piece of a puzzle, which is really crucial. Businesses having that, but then it goes down to home ownership and people around it being able to own what they have too. So it's part of a bigger picture. And I'm actually friends with Elvis Rubio, who works at the Nest office as well. And he just wants to see, he works every day with small businesses and just making sure that they can stay and thrive. So yeah, I think a program like this is incredible, as long as it gets larger support for the surrounding community as well.
Do you think Nest has the capacity or the resources, or even just can serve as a scaffold or a framework, as just a launching point in Denver, given their experience?
Yeah, I think they can serve as a connector too, because what it really takes to is private ownership and development to be interested in that. Like to say, this isn't just about getting top dollar for the lot that you bought and building the biggest possible thing. You have to think about what is going in next to that business. What do like businesses working together, people having more of a say in what happens in their communities. And Nest can really lay the groundwork for that. They can't control it. They're a city agency. You know what I mean? They're limited in their power, but I think it's important that they exist because they're an advocate for those businesses.
Yeah.
And that's huge.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, and Andrea, I didn't know if you saw in the chat, but Margaret was asking if, it could be something like SCFD where a portion of funds, I didn't know if you, in your research of the other programs, if they came from like a self-imposed cultural, like a tax district.
Yeah, I think the funding mechanisms, a lot of just come through tax dollars and things like that. So I think, SCFD is limited in how it's written into the statute. So in how that money can be expended back out. And certainly there's so many nonprofit, cultural performing organizations, music organizations that benefit from SCFD dollars. But the structure of SCFD, I don't think lends itself, especially when you're dealing with bricks and mortar or rent issues and things like that. That's where SCFD can't step in by statute, but certainly can help in programming if they're a nonprofit organization. But yeah, I think there's lots of great little puzzle pieces laying around and opportunities. And I think if we could just come up with a structure of sorts to plug all of these pieces into, we could create something like San Francisco or LA Conservancy to have something of a legacy program.
Andrea, you're correct. SFCD has a lot of restrictions.
Mhm.
Since they cannot give any funds to any kind of broadcast entity, be it public TV station or public radio station, college, community, even stations that are out in the indigenous land serving a very specified audience or migrant worker audiences. Unfortunately, the SFCD is not permitted to fund them, as you mentioned, with brick and mortar.
Mhm. Arturo, someone put in the chat that KUVO itself is a cultural resource. It should be protected.
Well, we feel we're a cultural resource because that's part of our logo: culture, community, and music. And notice that music is last.
Mhm.
Culture first, community second, and music third. And we're about embracing the community because up until COVID, from the Cinco de Mayo to mid-October, every weekend, sometimes 2 different places on the weekend, KUVO would have a booth at a community and cultural event manned by volunteers, because KUVO is overwhelmingly a volunteered power station. Yes, we have some staff, but overwhelmingly we're a volunteer powered station. And a few years ago, we merged with RMPBS Channel 6. And then last year, we adopted a third station, a hip hop and R&B station to attract younger audiences that was named the best station of the year by Westward. That's The Drop, which is now 104.7 FM as well as HD2 on KUVO signal. So we're trying to become more active with the community and bring the community of all ages to us, because we have to ensure that, and I'm part of this, the older graying audience of jazz, when we're not able to continue our patronage and listenership, that there'll be others behind us taking the baton to carry it forward. And that's the objective, I guess, of any cultural or music institution, you know, and that's where this funding can come in for legacy business, you know, hopefully used for cultural and music purposes, as well as small hands, mom and pop hands-on business. No, I'm optimistic, especially once, you know, Corona comes and go and we have the new normalcy. Things are happening now, the dynamics that are bringing people together, not spreading them apart.
So what show are you guys all going to go to when the new normal is back?
I mean, I'm a local music person. That's my whole community is music. Everybody I know lost 70% of their income overnight when you couldn't go to a show, you couldn't work, you know, maybe you worked at the bar at a venue, maybe you ran the soundboard, maybe you sold merchandise. Like, I literally will go to anything to support my friends and be able to be out in the community again. Because I think that's the one thing we really, I mean, there's a lot of things we miss with streaming, but the human interaction that you get at a concert, the energy you feel off of other people, the connections that you make when you're experiencing like an incredible moment in your life, because live music has that capability. Like, I just want to be in a venue, you know. I would love to be inside Ophelia's again, you know, yeah, it's such a great, for being a newer venue, it's got one of the best vibes. I just like to be there. I would just love to be shoulder to shoulder with some people again and see anything, really.
Well, as you mentioned about struggle musicians, Brie, just in case you may not be aware, Dazzle has a pantry, a bread and jam, they call it. Jam, pardon me, in this case, has a double entendre meaning. They're jamming on stage, and of course, the bread and jam. But any musician or artist that is struggling and could use some help, any Friday, Saturday, or Sunday, they can go to the Dazzle and go shopping for free. They'll even give you, you know, shopping bag, whatever you need. And there's all sorts of, you know, food items, non-perishable, of course, and household items. You know, not so much now anymore, but if you need TP or paper towels, they have that as well. Cleaning, disinfectant. It's all at the, you know, if you Brie, if you know an artist that needs a little help.
Oh yeah. Yeah. Dazzle.
No shame in the game. No shame in the game. It's not something done to embarrass anyone.
Yeah.
They're doing it to help because they're firmly entrenched into the musicians community.
Yeah. And musicians trust that, you know.
You know.
Musicians know that.
So, yeah.
Sure.
Okay. So spread the word.
Well, and Roy shared in the chat that he's headed to Dazzle, whatever's playing there, as soon as he can.
Yeah.
Which is
Yeah,
awesome.
they've opened up limited audience. I've been there the last 3 Saturdays. Very limited seating. You have to call ahead to reserve because they have to cut you off at a certain amount of attendees. You know, by law, and they get inspectors in there. And then they'll social distance you, and you must wear a mask if you're walking around. So you can only take your mask off when you're sitting down and eating. But if you need to walk around, you're gonna have to put your mask on. And that's the same at Nocturne and at the Muse. And I'm not sure about Herbs, which was mentioned earlier. I don't think they have reopened yet. There's a new place, the Plaza 38 on Lowell and 38 that has opened up that has live music as well. Limited audience. So it's starting to come back. And if no mutations or variants of COVID come along that knocks us out again, I think that the light is getting brighter at the end of the tunnel. With restrictions, of course, because even if you're vaccinated, that's not a guarantee. You still got to wear your mask and social distance and avoid large gatherings. You know, especially against a variant or a mutation, they weren't designed for that. So you still have to be careful, even if you're doubly vaccinated.
Yeah, I agree. It does seem like if we can all keep our masks on, we may get there sooner than we thought.
Exactly.
Then we can all be together. Because yeah, Roy also, he's been chatting a lot, which is wonderful. But he said there's nothing like the energy of the musician and the audience, and you just don't get that in the virtual.
Yeah.
And it is so true.
Wow, Roy says he can walk to the Muse. Oh my goodness, you have to go. It's run by 2 musicians, Pete Lewis and Claire Church, husband and wife, and it's a nonprofit. Oh, and they have 2 or 3 live shows with limited audience. And, you know, and then they got a bar where you can help yourself to a beer, a soda, and snacks and stuff for a donation. If you're that close that you can walk to the Muse, Roy Sargent. It's amazing. It's a great place. Tell them I sent you.
Yeah, and some other folks are just excited at all the places you mentioned, Arturo. They want to check them out.
Oh yeah, the Muse. If you is one in Lafayette, in Rhino, the Nocturne. You know, it's a little bit more upscale because of their menu. It's top-notch, you know, cuisine. They have a chef and they prepare some exquisite dishes along with your jazz, and they're known for their cocktails as well. You know, Dazzle's a little bit more, you know, down home, you know, with a night with food and stuff, lesser cost. But Dazzle does one thing that Nocturne doesn't do. That is doing their normal course of business before COVID. They bring in national acts. The Nocturne stakes with the Front Range, and we're blessed. The amazing amount of talent of musicians and the variety of musicians that we have along the Front Range, and I'm sure Brie can attest to this, is absolutely astonishing. It really is. It's one of the more fertile areas of the country for musicians, and with people supporting it and going to see them live when it's not, you know, COVID time. And I want to be like Brie. I want to go back to a jam session and be shoulder to shoulder with somebody. Hey, push me out of the way. Hey, isn't that great music? Because I don't hear music. I feel it.
That's awesome. And Sasha shared that virtual is pretty good in the meantime. And I do agree. I didn't mean to say that virtual is not, it's definitely been filling the void, at least in my life, and hopefully all of yours. Any other thoughts or reflections, a place that we haven't mentioned yet that you miss so much, either from our guests or our panelists? Oh, Margaret, and I did see you ask this question earlier in the program. She asked, will the pictures from the PEC be saved somewhere? And I don't know the answer. Do you, Arturo?
Well, to the best of my knowledge, unless it's changed, the family is keeping it. Then what they're going to do with everything from the PEC, they're not sure yet.
But they are going to hold on to it. Okay, so maybe, maybe Margaret, at some point that archive will be donated somewhere where we can see it again.
They early on, they had an auction where you could buy some of the photos, but I don't know if that's closed now or not. I know they were selling off everything in the, like the restaurant stuff in the bar as well. But I would maybe check with, I don't know where. I saw they had an online auction at some point.
Their website is still active and has, we're going to keep everything this website up and going, and our store sort of going until we've sold everything so that they want to sell. So, but yeah, maybe they could be convinced that some things could maybe go to someplace like History Colorado as, to, at least preserve a little bit of the legacy somehow. No.
No, Roy's gonna buy the bar. I like it.
Roy.
Nice. And it is true that they never owned the building, and the guy that does own the building is leasing it to somebody new. So we don't know what's going to go in there exactly, but I do think that he has a new tenant, so it'll be interesting to watch. Maybe they'll have heard Arturo and Brie's vision for the place.
We can hope that they do.
Yeah, but unfortunately we couldn't get too many more details on it, but we'll just have to watch.
Any more questions coming in, Allison?
Yes, Margaret just asked, can we be involved in any future efforts to preserve other independent venues? It's a great question, and I don't think we have a straightforward answer to it. We have seen a few venues have like GoFundMe, so that's a very low level to be involved. When it comes to Historic Denver, we can kind of get involved with the building. So if it is somebody that actually owns their building and they want help from that aspect, we have some resources we can provide. Otherwise, no, and I think that's partially when Andrea and so we wanted to do this program. We saw El Chapultepec had closed, but then all of a sudden we started seeing all these other little venues were closing, and they're by no means as historic as El Chapultepec, but I think we saw that and Tui's and one other one in all the same week. And
yeah,
I did feel like, I think, Margaret, your sense of urgency of what else can we do to support these places? And I don't think we have a very clear way. I think, if we can support them by paying for a virtual stream or going back to seeing them live. But I don't think that in Denver, we have a really clear path to help them.
Yeah, it's just also just supporting local musicians when we do open back up, because so many musicians are also working on other projects. Like, I know a ton of musicians that would have loved to keep the PEC open if they could have afforded to buy the business and run it as is, but when nobody's making any money, so it's tough. But if you can support local music and local venues when they do open back up, I know a lot of them, like the Oriental Theater has sort of a membership program right now, and you can join and pay monthly to help them stay open. I mean, that's literally what they need. That's honestly the best way, is just putting money in the hands of the venues and the musicians themselves.
I have many friends who have said that they're going to take their next stimulus check if and when they get it, and it's going to be completely set aside just for going to live music performances once they all stick. So I think we're all saving up for live music again. Well, thank you so much, Arturo and Brie. This was amazing to hear your great stories and sort of dive into the notion of how we might protect other legacy businesses here in Denver, and just, I think, barely scratch the surface at what a program here in Denver might look like, where we might be able to go next with this. Continue to keep dropping in your questions. If we don't answer them, we can pass them on to Arturo and Brie. So thank you guys so much. We do have some upcoming events as well, and I'll share my screen, Allison, one more time. We have coming up our 1340 Pen series next week. This is our program where we sort of explore Victorian era topics, and this one is sort of the jig is up, where we are going to dive into sort of what, you know, speakeasies might have looked like and what was going on in Denver in Margaret's time. And then I will be giving a director's tour on Tuesday, March 23rd, where we're going to dive in and explore the saving of the Molly Brown House Museum, its preservation, and of course the founding of Historic Denver and the grassroots preservation movement that sort of sprang out of that when you had someone like Dana Crawford on your board right away in 1970. It really provided a lot of great tools and resources and knowledge already for sort of building the preservation movement here in Denver. And then on March 25th, we have an Art with Amy, which is our guided art making virtual program, where you can come to the museum and pick up supplies, or we'll mail them to you. And then our art expert, Amy, will walk you through one of her great art projects that she comes up with. And then our next Empowered by Place is going to be on May 6th at 7 p.m. And we're going to talk with Gregorio Alcaro. His family ran the Casa Mayan restaurant on the 9th Street Historic Park in the Auraria neighborhood. So we're going to, again, look at these businesses that sort of mean a lot to Denver's history and legacy, and what happened when literally the entire neighborhood you were in was bulldozed, and how Historic Denver stepped in and helped create 9th Street Historic Park, and making sure that the Casa Mayan house restaurant itself was saved, so that we can continue to tell the legacy of their heritage and history here in Denver. So we hope you'll join us for that one. And then I'm going to let Allison give the pitch on this one.
Yes. And actually, I think everybody on this call is a completely perfect candidate because your head is already in the right place. But one of the ways that we're celebrating our 50th anniversary at Historic Denver is basically crowdsourcing the next places we should work on. So we have a form on our website. If you go to historicdenver.org and click on the 50 actions for 50 places, where you can submit a place that you care about that hasn't had a lot of preservation love so far. So the picture up here, those are 3 places that they're not preserved in any way. They could be subject to demolition. And so we're hoping to find more places like that we are passionate about as community members in Denver and that we care about. And so we're collecting these for the next 2 months. We're going to finish in May, and then we're actually going to be able to start coming up with action plans for each of the sites. So already on our website, we've got a map. You can see who has submitted what, so you're not like worried about submitting for the 5th time the Bonnie Bray Tavern. But tell us what you care about and what matters and why it matters. It's not like a research paper. It's a very short form. But you should share with us what you care about so that we can think about what are the places we're going to preserve next.
And it doesn't have to be a bricks and mortar structure. It can be a sign, it can be a landscape, it can be a statue or a monument or a piece of art in your neighborhood, a mural. So what can't you imagine Denver without, and what are those places? And then we will work with the community around that space or place to come up with some sort of solution that will help preserve the legacy of that place for Denver. So thank you all so much, and we hope you go to historicdenver.org and register for the next Empowered by Place. and come up with one of those places so we can create our 50 actions.
Thank you.
Thank you.
so much.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Yeah, thank you guys.
Bye.
All the best. Thank you so much.
Thank you,
Thank
Brie and
you.
Arturo.
Thank you
Yeah,
so
you
much.
bet.
I think, Brie, we're going to pick your brain in the future about how we make this legacy business
Oh
program
yeah.
reality.
Hit me up. Let me know. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Bye.